going on, guys? I'm Abby Martin. This is Breaking the Set. So you may remember that I traveled to Haiti last year to cover the cholera outbreak that killed 8,000 Haitians and made 650,000 people very sick. Now, all the evidence has shown that the outbreak was clearly introduced to the country by UN troops from Nepal. And naturally, victims of this deadly disease are demanding compensation from the UN. Today, an advocacy group filed a lawsuit against the international body and are seeking billions of dollars in damages for the country. But the UN has maintained that it is too big to sue and owes cholera-ridden Haitians nothing. Look, right now it costs the UN $500 million to maintain its troops in the country every year. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, it's projected that it would only cost $2.2 billion to completely eliminate cholera and restore proper sanitation throughout Haiti. So far, only one UN official has spoken out about the despicable refusal to own up to this enormous human health disaster. Navy Pillay, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, said, quote, "I still stand by the call that victims of those who suffered as a result of that cholera be provided with compensation." If you don't want Pillay to stand alone and think that the UN should pay for the blood on its hands, join me and let's break the set. Six students will face charges next week after being arrested during a protest against General David Petreaus. The retired general is coming under fire for his teaching job at CUNY, but he's also reportedly making big bucks to mentor students at the University of Southern California. RT's Ramon Galindo is in Los Angeles with the reaction to Petreaus' move into academia.
As the U.S. enters its 13th year of the Afghanistan war, one of the major protagonists, General David Petreaus, is once again facing harsh criticism. After retiring from the CIA following a sex scandal, Petreaus was given a high-profile teaching gig here at the prestigious University of Southern California. However, some here in Los Angeles don't think he deserves that honor.
To murder thousands upon thousands of innocent civilians just to advance the interests of the United States is criminal. And coming here to USC, which is regarded as one of the pillars of education, decent education here in Los Angeles, particularly here in the part of town, it's kind of like ridiculous.
Many in the mainstream press hail General Petreaus as a war hero. However, critics point out many failures in his administering of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars.
Somehow in America, we do have a history of violence, let's face it. And I was part of that being in the Vietnam War. We have a history where we seem to celebrate violence. We seem to think that violence is the answer. It clearly isn't.
There are thousands of U.S. soldiers who lost legs or are dead because they were being sent on missions by Petreaus that had no other purpose but to advance Petreaus' own career. He should be tried and he should be in prison. But instead of being sent to jail, instead of people like him and Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld, all of these people that are guilty of really one of the greatest atrocities of this generation, instead of being held accountable, they're making millions of dollars on book tours and getting, six-figure honorariums to speak at universities and getting hired as guest lecturers at universities like this.
Students at the City University of New York were arrested for protesting the arrival of David Petreaus. Here in Southern California, activists are calling for Petreaus to face justice instead of facing the student body. In Los Angeles, Ramon Galindo, RT.
The ongoing incompetence at the Fukushima nuclear power plant is consistently making headlines, but gross ineptitude is also happening at a nuclear facility right here in the U.S. See, last week a government report showed that the replacement of the facility housing radioactive liquid waste at Los Alamos National Laboratory is 11 years behind schedule. According to the report, this treatment facility is 50 years old, it's falling apart, and has even failed on occasion, which means that the lab cannot process radioactive waste while repairs are being made. This disturbing report comes on the heels of a 2011 wildfire that came just within 1 mile of the New Mexico desert facility and its 20,000 drums of plutonium waste. So to discuss this dire state of the facility, I was joined earlier by Greg Mello, Executive Director of the Los Alamos Study Group, and I started by asking him how it got to this point.
By repeated collisions between the contractor's ambition and the federal changes of direction and the poor political relationship, the contractors are much too powerful, so that the federal government can't really step in as clearly as it needs to, and is just not used to doing that in the case of Los Alamos.
What kind of contractors are we talking about here?
We're talking about, in this case, of Bechtel, the URS Corporation, B&W, and the University of California, which have a partnership to run Los Alamos National Laboratory. Before that, it was the University of California.
Same with Lawrence Livermore Lab, so it's been essentially privatized at this point.
Yes, fully privatized.
You know, if the lab has no way of processing radioactive liquid waste, what's happening with this material?
Well, it is being processed. The facility is old, it's been patched, there's workarounds, and when there's a problem, there are storage tanks that slowly fill up, and then the waste is processed in a kind of a campaign or batch mode. But it's not seismically sound, and you know, there are safety problems, so it has to be, something has to be done on a more permanent basis. And the question is, on what scale, how grandiose, and should the operating contractor, which is supposedly a scientific organization, be doing this nitty-gritty waste management, or whether somebody else should be brought in more competent.
Right. Well, what is a solution for this glaring incompetence? I mean, if this has been privatized and there's just this utter lack of regulatory oversight on the facility, what next?
Well, there needs to be a real assessment of what missions should be given to the management and operating contractor and what should be split off. So construction almost certainly should be split off because they have a really bad record of that. We think that nuclear weapons are an inherently federal function of government, and that this should not be a profit-driven, privatized, secretive. I mean, these are not, Bechtel is not a publicly traded company even, it's a privately held company. So none of this World War II pattern basically should still be existing at this point. We'd rather see it run like the National Institute of Health, or NASA, or the Naval Research Laboratory, which are federal. So there wouldn't, the profit component would be taken out.
You know, you've said that Los Alamos is also the center for plutonium manufacturing in the country, even though the area is prone to many natural disasters like wildfires and earthquakes. Is Los Alamos a potential Fukushima waiting to happen?
Los Alamos is a problem-ridden facility for reasons of natural hazard, as well as because it's a sociologically misfitting facility. It's different than the rest of the state. It's up on the hill. It's always had cultural problems. It's isolated. So is it a potential Fukushima? No, it's not a potential Fukushima, but it's still a place where serious accidents could happen. Serious accidents, to some extent, have happened already, but hopefully those could be minimized going forward. And the question right now, or a question, is to what extent can the laboratory get around modern safety regulations? They have multi-page list of safety regulations they'd like not to follow.
I grew up in Livermore, or next to Livermore, the only other site in the country that develops and stockpiles nuclear weapons, Greg, and their facility has had extraordinary problems in the past, from dumping plutonium down the drains to lack of containment and a potential for large-scale environmental disaster in the Bay Area. Has anything else happened with the facility in Los Alamos over the years that should ring alarm bells?
Yeah. Los Alamos did the same thing. There were approximately 2,000 contaminated places at Los Alamos. Some have been cleaned up, some have been consolidated, some have been deemed worthy of no great interest. But the fact remains there are about a dozen nuclear landfills, nuclear chemical landfills at Los Alamos, and various spills that have gone into the canyons. So yes, there's a problem there, much more than Livermore.
And would you say that the nuclear arms race is still alive and well today?
Yes, I'd say. The Obama administration, in fact, has put forward the largest, the most audacious proposal for new warheads of any administration. They have a $275 billion plan to modernize the warheads and bombs over the next 25 years. That doesn't include the plutonium facilities that might be needed, and it is widely considered to be an underestimate on Capitol Hill. Most people think it's kind of a fantasy, a nuclear weapons scientist's dream, but it is the official plan. And it's resulted from the Obama administration caving into the contractors, caving into the Republicans, and having people in the administration who are left over or have been emplaced from the private contractors into the administration that push these kind of plans.
Very serious issue. Thank you so much for coming on, breaking some of it down. Greg Mello, Executive Director of the Los Alamos Study Group.
Thank you so much, Abby.
Stick around after the break. I'll talk to Max Blumenthal about his new book, Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. Here in the Beltway, Washingtonians have been facing a very serious question. Should the NFL team, the Washington Redskins, change its name? After all, when D.C. was the murder capital of the country, its basketball team changed its name from the Bullets to the Wizards. Yes, it seems like political correctness is great fodder for superficial debate. When it comes to pop culture, it's easy to have an opinion on a PC NFL. But rather than focus on what an American football team does, how about we start paying attention to the real issue at hand, the dire condition of Native Americans in this country. Native Americans were the original inhabitants of the U.S., but European descendants took their land and either killed them or corralled them into a corner. And ever since, they've been largely forgotten. Over the past centuries, their sovereignty has been stripped and their culture has been destroyed. They're prohibited from practicing their religion, and their children were taken to schools for re-education. The few survivors of this near genocide are often stuck on the remaining 310 reservations in the U.S. Let's call them what they really are: prison camps, because the conditions they endure on these pieces of land are often abominable. See, Native Americans haven't just been victims of American Indian wars and Manifest Destiny. They've also been the victims of capitalism. The railroad and mining corporations exploited the reservation lands and forced a people that had not yet been part of a wage economy into commodification. And that commodification has manifested itself into the form of a casino industrial complex, an industry that's overtaken reservations and made its population solely reliant on the industry. It's a trend that journalist Chris Hedges refers to as capitalism's sacrifice zones. Voiceless parts of the country trapped in endless cycles of poverty, powerlessness, and despair. And nothing exemplifies this stark reality more than Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota.
It's appalling. You know, the average life expectancy for a male in Pine Ridge is 48. That is the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti. At any one time, 60% of the dwellings do not have electricity or water.
The unemployment rate at Pine Ridge fluctuates between 70 and 85%. Infant mortality is 3 times higher than the national average. And since a majority of the land on reservations is held communally, indigenous people can't adapt to society by owning property, making it difficult to establish credit or borrow money. These limited opportunities are a sign of a disappearing culture and a country that's doing almost nothing to preserve it. This fact, combined with a constant outlet for toxic gambling, could be why such a large percentage of Native Americans drown their sorrows in alcohol. Alcoholism is an epidemic. In fact, 1 in 10 Native Americans die from alcohol-related deaths, 3 times higher than the general population, according to the Centers for Disease Control. The only thing that's more prevalent on reservations than alcoholism is the alarming number of suicides. According to the CDC, suicide rates have increased by 65% over the past decade amongst Native American youth. So what can we do to combat this problem? Well, we changed the conversation, because the government's solution is to shroud this country's shameful treatment of Native Americans with alcohol and gambling. And the American people only see the debate as nothing more than a name on a football jersey. Back from an impassioned speech at the UN about the threat Iran poses to the world, Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu spoke to an audience in Israel at Bar Ilan University. Shockingly, though, the speech wasn't a bunch of fear-mongering about Iran. No, Bibi actually took the time to talk about Palestine, but maybe not the way you'd hope. See, using references to Palestinian leadership in the early 20th century, Bibi actually tried to link today's Palestinians to the Nazis of the 1940s. Yet despite this harsh rhetoric and the abysmal conditions of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation, America's political support for Israel remains strong. So here to help me break down this issue further, I'm joined by Max Blumenthal, a journalist who's been exploring the cultural and political shifts within Israel, and the author of the best-selling new book, Goliath: Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. Max, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, and just to clarify, the new book isn't a bestseller yet, but
it will be.
Your viewers can help me.
Awesome. Well, Max, you talk about multiple forces that are driving this base of support for Israel within the U.S. What are they?
Well, obviously, there's the Israel lobby. AIPAC, which is the key arm of the Israel lobby, is one of the most powerful forces driving support for Israel in the United States, but also there is sort of a curtain of silence around the facts on the ground. What Netanyahu seeks to obscure in his own backyard, and what I want to do with my book, Goliath: Life and Loathing in Israel, is break that curtain of silence and get behind the veneer of propaganda that's been erected in this country. Now, you mentioned Netanyahu's speech at the UN in New York, and then him going back to Israel, to Bar Ilan University, which is the academic base of religious nationalism in Israel, and spending 15 minutes ranting about how the Palestinians are the heirs to the Nazis and how the Palestinian national movement was directly engaged in the final solution and the killing of Jews in Europe, which is completely false. But beyond that is pure incitement. He delivered this speech in Hebrew, and meanwhile the U.S. is trying to conduct a peace process with Netanyahu. Under Netanyahu's terms, this man is supposed to be a partner for peace who's calling Palestinians Nazis. So you see him speaking one language in the U.S., saying he wishes for a peaceful future for Israelis and Palestinians, and another language in Israel. And in my book, in my chapter about Netanyahu, I call him the salesman because I talk about his marketing efforts of Israel in the U.S. I write about a little-known quote that he delivered at the same university, Bar Ilan University, in 1989, where he talks about how he urged then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, and he was in Shamir's government, to begin conducting a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing in the occupied territories because the world's attention was focused on Tiananmen Square in China and the protests there. Now Netanyahu has the world's attention focused on Iran, and this is part of his strategy to continue conducting human rights abuses and crimes in his own backyard, away from the world's attention.
And Max, as we know, up until recently, there was actually a eugenics-style program administering birth control forcibly to Ethiopian Jewish communities, unbeknownst to them. Can you speak about the discrimination within Israel against African Jews and asylum seekers?
Yeah, you mentioned something that is a disturbing story about the kind of abuses that are meted out to Ethiopian Jews, and this occurred in a transit camp run by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, where women were given Depo-Provera shots without knowing, which suggests that the government of Israel wanted to limit the number of black babies, even if they were Jewish. But what we see in Israel increasingly, and especially in Tel Aviv, is a massive campaign of racist incitement and violence against the 60,000 non-Jewish African refugees who have made these harrowing treks across the Sinai Desert, fleeing violence in regions like Darfur, in places like Eritrea, fleeing repression. And they had heard that Israel was a country that was honoring the legacy of the Holocaust and cared about refugees, and instead, increasingly, by the hundreds and the thousands, they're being placed in a camp in the Negev desert in the south of Israel called Saharonim, entire families, including women and children, for as long as 3 years, a camp that the Israeli architectural collective Bikrom has called a concentration camp with harsh conditions. And they're being placed there not only because they're migrants who aren't citizens of the State of Israel, but because they are non-Jews who cannot become citizens of the State of Israel, because the only path to citizenship is in Israel right now is to be like me and to have J-positive blood.
Max, there's a chapter in your book that also talks about the institutionalized discrimination within the country. Can you just elaborate on some of the policies that exist that exemplify this kind of state-sponsored discrimination?
Yeah, I mean, I could spend the rest of your show or the rest of the evening talking about that, but one thing that's worth mentioning that has been ignored in the Western media, especially in the U.S. press, is that a recent Israeli Supreme Court decision ruling against petitioners calling for an Israeli national identity. In other words, Israel is probably the only country in the world that has no national identity. Instead, identity is afforded according to your ethnicity, Druze, Arab, Jewish, and your rights and privileges are given to you based on your ethnicity, and if you're Jewish, you have superior citizenship privileges. Now, since the foundation of the State of Israel, there has not been a single village, town, or city built for Arab citizens of Israel. Meanwhile, in the Negev desert right now, where 80,000 indigenous Palestinian Bedouins live in unrecognized villages, where they're not allowed to hook up to the electricity grid, even though electricity wires run over their villages. They can't get any public services because they're not Jews. There is a plan called the Prover Plan that will forcibly relocate 40,000 of those indigenous Bedouins to state-run Indian reservation-style towns, which, according to a government-linked website, the Or Movement, have been built to concentrate the Bedouin population. This will be the largest campaign of ethnic cleansing, possibly, since 1948. And you have to wonder, why aren't we hearing about this in our media? What I'm trying to do with my book, Goliath, is just simply educate people and get past this curtain of silence that obscures human rights crimes like the kind we're discussing now.
Absolutely. I wanted to get your opinion on this. Recently, I was talking to Norman Finkelstein, and he was saying that Obama's kind of trying to reinvigorate the peace process because he's failing politically. How much of the peace process do you think has been just completely co-opted and turned into a meaningless political tool?
I think it's been kind of a meaningless political tool since the beginning, and we have to note that there has never been a U.S. proposal for a Palestinian state. Now, I know that sounds kind of ridiculous because we're constantly talking about a Palestinian state, but a state means you're allowed to have a military. A state means you're allowed to control your borders. A state means you're allowed to control all the territory within your borders. In a state, you get airspace. You get to control your water resources. And according to the U.S. plan, the Palestinian Authority is entitled to absolutely none of those. Especially control of its own borders, and it will receive only a small portion of the land that it was originally entrusted with in the Oslo Accords 20 years ago. Since the Oslo Accords, 150,000 settlers have been moved into the West Bank by the State of Israel. So it's basically a joke, and what Obama and John Kerry are doing is buying more time so they don't have to make a decision and ring the alarm on Israeli apartheid. Israel is using the peace process or the talks, and Netanyahu says he's committed to peace talks, with the operative word being talks, to continue building more settlement units while the Palestinian Authority is locked into this timetable and can't do anything. So it's not only a charade, it's a dangerous exercise which is leading to increasing human rights abuses and colonization beneath the rhetoric of peace.
Right, and of course, I mean, actions speak much louder than this meaningless rhetoric that we hear time and time again, president after president. Israel's obviously the third rail in American politics. You simply cannot question the Israeli government's policies without being labeled certain things. How can we get anywhere with this issue if the world community won't even push back against Israel's violations of international law? We have about a minute left.
I think we're seeing people talk about it more. I think we're seeing the debate shifting, and I think we're increasingly seeing the Israel lobby exposed as a paper tiger. The more people who are willing to challenge it, I think, the more we're going to see a tidal wave of resistance in favor of a humanitarian solution to the Israel-Palestine crisis. And the center of this, at the bottom of this tidal wave, is the Palestinian-led BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, which I cover extensively in my book, Goliath.
Absolutely. Journalist Max Blumenthal, crucial issue. We need to put the pressure on and get this story out there. Everyone check out the book, Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much to everyone at home for tuning in tonight. Please be sure to join me again to break the set all over again tomorrow.